And we can now launch into our live debate on that very issue of carbon farming, but we're getting back to that survey in just a moment in my first question. But first, let me welcome here all with us Liam Condon, a member of the Board of Management of Bayer AG and President of the Crop Science Division, also responsible for Latin America and Africa. Innovation is his business in languages ranging from Gaelic to Mandarin. And yes, I left out Japanese. He has a sales and marketing background, so I hope to find out from him whether carbon farming will become the next big thing or a hard sell to those expected to implement it. Ambassador Ertharin is a visiting scholar at the Center on Food Security and Environment at Stanford University. In the past, she was executive director of the World Food Programme. She's a founding member of the Food Systems for Future Institute and has appeared on the odd Times and Forbes list of most influential and powerful people. So who better to ask about the power of carbon farming? And Dr. Agnes Kalibata, Rwandan agricultural scientist and policymaker and president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA. She's also previously served as Rwanda's Minister of Agriculture, and we look forward to hearing from her how the very idea of carbon farming is being received and can be applied in African countries and beyond. But first, let me start with that little survey that we did. We asked people to tell us what they felt were the most important innovative approaches needed to solve problems like climate change, food insecurity, and pandemics. And I'll start with you, Liam Condon. I'll put those results to you. We had 85% saying carbon farming is key, 81% saying adjustment of consumer eating habits, 74% digitalization, 70% genome editing, expansion of the private sector is kind of a minor issue at 30% and other 15. We're not going to get to other, but clearly we are on that factor of carbon farming. Would you do a similar ranking? First carbon farming, then consumer adjustment, then digitalization?
I guess I would, Michaela, I would indeed start with carbon farming. The only thing is you actually need several other tools to make carbon farming work. So, for example, digitalization is absolutely crucial for our ability to ensure that we can actually do carbon farming in a manner that it will work also for farmers. And consumer behavior is, of course, going to be key. But I actually thought when I went through the list, I think all of them are important. I think there's an interaction between all of them. But the key point is that carbon farming is a new way of doing agriculture that can help make agriculture part of the solution to climate change, so that we're not just focusing on what we produce, but actually how we produce. And that's where I think that the real benefit of this can kick in.
Ertharin, does carbon farming strike you as something that we should have singled out, or are we all wrong? Is it part of this complex structure of things that need to all take place at the same time? Please unwrap that for us.
Well, the reality is, Liam's actually absolutely right. All of the items that you listed are all interconnected. And if we want to get the full benefit from agriculture for carbon reduction and sequestration, and we need carbon farming, but some would even argue that diet change is part of carbon farming, because when consumers change their diets, that will affect animal production on farms. And that can be considered in that basket of tools that we talk about when we talk about regenerative agriculture. And we know that that would have a significant impact on the reduction of emissions by how we produce livestock on our farms. But the reality is, if we look at the tools that we have today, like no-till or different types of cropping methodologies, agroforestry, each one of those has a limited impact. You need all of them in order to ensure that you are going to deliver the level of emissions reductions that are necessary to make a difference. And most importantly, what you need is scale. And that is why, despite the fact that your audience didn't think so, private sector is so important to us achieving the outcomes of a carbon farming system that includes all these elements that ultimately, because you have private sector involved, you can get a carbon price for the work that farmers perform that will give us the incentive that farmers need to scale up at a level that will achieve the type of emission reduction that is necessary to make a difference in us achieving the 11 gigatons that WR and FAO say we need to reduce from agricultural production.
Agnes Kalibata, Professor Flesser also said that in this address just a short while ago, and I hope you're still with us because I can't actually see you. Yes, there you are. The price is a factor. Professor Flesser also said we need to put a price on it, but from where you are sitting, is that a bit too far down the line? Where to start when it comes to carbon farming?
No, thank you. The pricing of carbon is already happening, so it's not far-fetched. And when we were doing the introductory remarks, one of the things that I didn't hear from our expert who introduced the subject, what I would have loved to hear is the system performance and how these systems are rated. So for example, there's a whole lot of carbon that is generated from intense farming systems that are out there, high industrial farming systems that then I consider carbon farming in terms of excesses and contribution to carbon. And then we are looking at the carbon farming from underperforming systems as well. So our world seems to be divided into two systems, overperforming systems that are pumping a lot of carbon in the environment and underperforming systems that are failing to give us the opportunity to offset that overperformance and the carbon that is being pumped into the environment. Now, in terms of pricing, there's a huge opportunity from an agricultural perspective that is not being exploited. I look at lots of carbon crediting goes to forests and preventing deforestation and stuff like that. Very little, I think there's maybe 2 countries, Australia and some projects in Ethiopia, very little goes into incentivizing farming systems to go into carbon farming. And I think until we figure that out and try to start using that as an incentive, it will be very difficult to really talk about carbon pricing unless we come up with a carbon pricing mechanism that allows food systems, especially from the productivity level, to take credit for some of the farming that is taking place or sacrifices in the farming that would take place.
We'll go a bit further on that whole question of incentive and policy. But Liam Condon, first I want to ask you, I mean, Bayer is a company that has been working on that very aspect of performance for decades. When you look into the future, and you need a business plan for this, for the future, where is the commercial future? Is it on pushing harder to get more out of crops, or is it a system change? What are you as a business preparing for?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. It's a fantastic question. So we actually, a few years ago, we had a big strategic debate internally, and we took a very, I think, important decision to make sustainability part of our business model. And this isn't just rhetoric, but the way we had looked at things in the past was sustainability was something we had to do to maintain our license to operate, but it wasn't necessarily something that generated additional value within our company. And we went through a very long strategic debate and eventually came to the conclusion that we needed to get ahead of the curve here and really embed sustainability into everything we do, from a research and development point of view, product supply, but also commercialization. And this is where actually the idea came in. That's why we started already years ago to work on carbon farming and to make it a business opportunity. So not something where we're just kind of helping farmers to farm in a better way, but actually tapping into a new income stream, both for farmers and for Bayer, and rewarding farmers for doing the right thing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions through agriculture, and helping consumers have more choice then for low carbon or ideally zero carbon food. So that was a very active decision on our side. And I'd say since then we've been experimenting, trying to push the boundaries on what's possible. Right now we have the broadest program in the world. We're on several million acres. We've a long way to go. But we've learned a lot in the last few years. And I think what's key, and this was mentioned earlier, this can't only be private companies and farmers working together. You need a regulatory framework. You also need independent bodies who are going to be able to certify how much carbon was actually sequestered. So there's a variety of actors that need to come together to create a system that will allow us to get to the scalability that Ertharin spoke about.
Ambassador Kazan, I would like to pick up on the whole policy architectures that are behind this. We earlier spoke about farm to fork. We spoke about the EU Green Deal. We had a representative of European farmers. And the last thing that they want, and I'm sure it's true for farmers all over the world, is more pieces of paper to fill in, more hoops to jump through. And there seems to be very little appetite for change, but also very little trust, I have to say, that policymakers will create incentives that don't leave farmers worse off. What's your perspective there?
Well, I think that the farmers have every right to be skeptical. We often have policies that we identify at the global or regional level that detrimentally impact farmers. The opportunity to make the kinds of changes that both Agnes and Liam have been talking about is directly related to our ability to incentivize farmers to support the changes that are necessary. We know that initial farming and agricultural changes and practices that are necessary to get us to a point where we are actually sequestering carbon through regenerative agricultural activities costs farmers money. Cost farmers money in the productivity of their land, cost farmers money in what they plant and how they plant. And so we need governments that provide the policies that incentivize and support the farmers' change, as well as their ability to maintain those new farming systems. Over the longer term, we need exactly what Liam said, that regulatory environment and that market-making tools that policymakers can implement that will support the development of an aggressive and robust carbon market that will provide ongoing incentives, financial incentives for farmers to support their performance of this work. But I would be remiss if I didn't and underscore the point that Agnes made about the fact that we have a two-tiered farming system problem right now. We have what's happening when we talk about these issues in Europe and the United States, and what's happening that we need to subsidize and support the agricultural changes that are necessary across developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, that will increase productivity, leapfrog the challenges that have resulted in the agricultural systems that we have today, and put those farmers in the position where they can benefit from these new carbon markets that we're discussing.
Agnes Kalibata, can you pick up from there? Because the big question is, can this work on all continents, or what kind of connect would there need to be? And how big is your faith that African governments, for instance, will engage fast enough to make this viable?
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ertharin, for elaborating on that point that I made. So I'm not sure that the question and the issue is African governments here. Let's be very clear. The issue of carbon and dealing with the challenge of carbon is not an African problem. We are actually suffering from climate change that we have contributed very little to. So that said, African governments have one preoccupation: adaptation strategy. We have to cope. Whatever happens, we have to cope, because the challenge is with us, and we have to ensure that farmers cope. Number one. Number two, we can't be part of the problem. So we didn't contribute to the problem, but we also don't want to be part of the problem. Not being part of the problem comes in several ways. Today, farmers increase their yields by extending into more land that has better carbon, more land that has better nitrogen, because they are looking for better productivity, right? So like our introducing remarks we are saying, there are natural limitations. That Africa's biggest natural limitation is nutrients, is availability of nutrients in African soils. That is a fact. And to be able to produce, we need to find ways of enhancing nutrients in African soils. So finding ways of increasing productivity through improving crop varieties, through better fertilization, not the traditional, better fertilization methods, judicious fertilization methods. And there are a number, microdosing, pelleting, there are a number that have already been tried that we can better agronomic practices. Remember, I'm an entomology, and I can tell you a few push and pull technologies that you can apply out there and minimize pesticide use. So yes, we do have a few things that Africa needs to start putting on, adopting to ensure that we reduce the problem. And Africa's reducing the problem is continuously minimizing the amount of land that is being put into agriculture systems. The only way we can do that viably is to ensure that we up our yields a little bit more, so that farmers don't have to depend on land rather than depend on better yields. Now, you talked about commercial viability when you're talking about to Liam. Commercial viability is going to have to be a certain point that we can define, we need to define. It can't be the extremes that we are seeing in some countries that are doing very well from an agricultural production perspective. Neither can it be the extreme that we are seeing in Africa from a lack of productivity perspective. It has to be somewhere in the middle. We have to strike a middle ground that reduces the amount of carbon from agricultural systems and that ups Africa's capability to produce and feed people and minimize impact on degrading the environment. So those type of things are going to have to define the type of policies that Africa as a continent can take on. And like I said, we are already on top of adaptation in terms of finding means of adopting, and we are going to have to find policies that can help farmers deal with reducing, ensuring that we are also not part of the problem of climate change. I've restricted my conversation to agriculture systems. I do know there are other things, but here I'm talking about agriculture.
Liam, maybe you can map out what you believe are probably the three most essential tools out of the toolkit to get towards carbon neutral farming.
Yeah, sure. So I guess first and foremost, and I'll take up your comment on the fact that farmers don't want to be filling out more pieces of paper and more administration. I mean, whatever the approach is, it's got to be light touch, and it's got to be somehow low cost from an implementation point of view. And the problem today is actually verifying carbon sequestration on a farm is actually quite an expensive and quite an administratively heavy process. So as long as that exists, there's not going to be any kind of scalability involved. Here we see the single biggest opportunity is actually through digitalization. So we do have the ability today with a digital system to, in essence, measure how much carbon sequestration is taking place, to verify that, to record it. And then in an ideal world, you would link this also up to a carbon emissions trading platform. This would all happen without the farmer actually having to do anything except for just use a digital system. And there are different methods here. This could also be satellite based. But through digitalization, you can make this light touch, low cost, and get the carbon verification that is required. So digitalization, I think, is number one. Number two, there needs to be some degree of standardization of carbon sequestration in the agricultural space. And Professor Flessa mentioned that agriculture is super diverse. Every region, every locality is different. Crops are very different, and they have a different carbon footprint. And we need scientific methodologies that, in essence, will calculate per crop, per region, what the real impact is. So science-based approach from a methodology point of view is absolutely crucial. And the third one, and I wouldn't say this is our technology based, but I would just mention it because it's so important. It's been mentioned again, again, again. Incentivization. Unless there is incentivization, all the tools and best practices in the world simply won't be used. So the incentivization has to be adequate. And here I would honestly say, if you look at the total bucket of money in agriculture today, there's not a lack of money. There's not a lack of subsidies in agriculture. There's not a lack of firms or companies also willing to invest in this space, but it's distributed very, very unevenly. And here I think we've got to do a better job of making incentivization open to all who are truly interested in carbon farming.
Yes, Ambassador Cousin, maybe you can talk to us in relation to the UN Food Systems Summit coming up. When we're talking about these buckets of money being thrown around at the problem, what are your hopes and fears in terms of carbon farming, but also beyond what might be the outcome or might not be? Your sound is up.
You saw Agnes and I both begin to laugh simultaneously as you raised that question to me about my desires for the outcomes of the UN Food Systems Summit, as Agnes is the Secretary General's Special Envoy and leading the UN Food Systems Summit. And
so she has a stake in it. She has a stake in it.
Yeah. Well, and so she pushed right back on me and say that I serve as a champion and on the leadership team for the summit. So I have a stake in it as well. And I think that I would argue that the entire global community has a stake in a successful food system summit, because the outcome that we need to achieve from the food system summit is a commitment from the global community on a way forward to achieving a food system that provides not only for the environmental changes that we've been talking about here today, but also about the health changes that are necessary to support the access to more nutritious food by everyone on the planet. There are 3 billion people today who can't afford what we define as a healthy quality meal. And we also need to finally ensure as an outcome of this summit that there's an opportunity for economic return for all the stakeholders across the food system, from smallholder farmers to farm workers to producers to investors in the food system, as well as large business actors like Bayer and others. And so that is what we need from the summit, is that shared ambition is articulated in a narrative that is implementable in every country around the world, every community around the world, corporations around the world, and particularly on farms across the globe.
But of course, Agnes Kalibata, I'm going to come to you as well on this. Let's stick with figures, though, because we're talking about this narrative and bringing everyone together. But, you know, the will declared at a summit is the one thing. How confident are you that in terms of incentives and actually something being put together that creates incentives where they're probably more needed than in some other regions actually reach where they need to be?
Thank you for that question. So from a food systems perspective, I think we are recognizing that probably the biggest challenge of our times today is not so much about, just to put it bluntly, maybe even money. It's really going to have to be how much people know about what is at stake. The challenge of knowing that we have run out of time from a food systems perspective, in doing business as usual and expect different results, in expecting that climate change is going to go away by some miracle. No, it's a responsibility that we share as a globe, irrespective of where we are, to do something about climate change. You and I eat 3 times a day. We have a responsibility to ensure that that's not impacting climate, through reducing waste, through not making unnecessary demands on our environment. Eat that good avocado, without necessarily having it be size 22. You know what I mean? Because that means so much more water. So really, we've tried to work so hard to ensure that everybody understands what is at stake. as human beings that have come at crossroads. We've also tried to understand that, to try to work so hard to help people understand that as communities, we have stewardship of this planet, and we must steward it to the future and leave it to our children. We've worked so hard to help governments understand that they have a responsibility here. So I hope that all of us do come to an understanding by the Food Systems Summit that allows us to make the necessary pivots. Yes, we must feed people. Yes, we must move economies, but we must do so within the boundaries of our planet. And I believe that there's enough momentum, there's enough energy, and there's enough will for people to want to do the right thing, and for people to really now find ways of supporting communities that are going to be behind. If they need incentives to be able to move forward, it's really how we structure those incentives. The reason I said that the issue is not how much money there is, it's because the food system itself has $12 trillion in hidden costs that could be used to do the right thing, that could be used to improve carbon farming while moving communities forward and while providing the right incentives. So again, this is all opening up a whole new territory. And my belief is that we get it moving by the time of the Food Systems Summit. The next 10 years will really show a complete food systems effect that will help us transform our food system, just as we are beginning to see the Paris effect take on climate change.
I just want to take two concrete aspects to you. I have a question here, it's really two, from Larry Schultz, who's tuned in. And he asks, what types of plant-based meat alternatives will be feasible in the future? It's a very concrete question, but also a question on innovation, what the current and future focuses for applications for the use of AI in agriculture are.
What was that to me, Michaela?
Yes, both to you.
Okay,
yeah.
So, thanks a lot. Really appreciate the question.
I thought there might be a business plan in it. That's why I'm asking.
Sure. On plant-based meat alternatives, this is also, I have to say, a space where we as Bayer are actively investing. And I think right now, the focus is heavily, or the companies who are selling actually quite a lot of produce, they're all actually based on plants like soybeans or other types of beans or peas, using as a source of protein. And clearly there's a very high consumer demand for these types of products. From an innovation point of view, what we expect for the future actually to be a much bigger market is what's called cell-based or cell-cultured meat, where in essence you just simply take one cell out of an animal and you artificially basically breed then meat from that cell. So you have a real meat product. It's not a plant-based product. It's actually a real meat-based product, like as in an animal-based product, without having to slaughter the animal and without having all the, let's say, additional greenhouse gas effects from a production point of view. So we think actually that will probably be a very lucrative market in the future, and it's also a space that we have actively invested in for the future. And on the second one, on artificial intelligence, we use this extensively already today in our research and development. So a concrete example, in our breeding, we have programs called precision breeding. And what we have moved from in the past, the way breeding was done, breeders were artists. They would try and cross the most productive plants and plants with traits that would allow them to be climate smart or maybe drought resistant or have other kind of tolerance traits. But this is a process that takes many, many, many years. Thanks to artificial intelligence, we're basically moving towards a scenario through algorithms that we can actually design the plants of the future to have favorable traits. Again, it might be a higher yield, it might be combined with a particular disease tolerance or a drought resistance or salt water tolerance. And this is a huge paradigm change in research and development, that we move from breeding through selection to actually breeding, design-based breeding, and that's only possible with digital automation, and in this case, artificial intelligence, just as one concrete example.
Ertharin Cousin, I also have a question for you here from Jose Luis Montes Claros. He asks, what is the best way to organize carbon farming and soil regeneration? For example, and I'm not sure whether this will actually work, using a hypothetical case of a community of 100 rice farmers.
Well, we know that there are rice production methodologies that can reduce the turnover of soil, that will sequester more of the carbon over longer periods of time. But what we also know is that that 100 farmers needs to be 100 million farmers in order for us to truly capture the amount of carbon that is necessary for agriculture to make a difference. We need those 100 farmers, but we need them in partnership and supported by frameworks that will incentivize them to capture that carbon for both the short and the long term, and that will incentivize them to work in partnership with others to scale up their work in a way that will make a difference. And if I can just say, when Liam made the point about new plant-based foods and AI and other technologies coming online, I want to underscore for those 100 farmers out there and others that we need to ensure that new tools that come online in a way that is affordable for those 100 farmers, those 100 rice farmers working in the area where the questioner is living today and around the globe. So too often we see these new tools that could create those adaptation opportunities and those carbon farming opportunities coming online for affluent farmers or even affluent consumers. In order for us to maximize these opportunities that these tools provide, we need the incentives and financial subsidies and support to ensure that those tools have that there's a broad-based access to all of the new tools that come online.
I just want to do, thank you so much. I just want to do, it felt a bit like an exam question, actually. I'd like to do a final round with all three of you and just ask you to briefly tell me what is your biggest hope in terms of carbon farming and your biggest fear when you look at the 10 next years, the next decade ahead. And I'd like to start with Agnes Kalibata.
Thank you. My biggest hope is really that we all recognize that time has come for us to start farming in a way that we can reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So my hope, we do generate about, 15 gigatons from food systems every year. If we can be able to ensure that our food systems as we go forward are carbon neutral, that would be really, really huge. My biggest fear is there are a lot of us, probably too many of us, whose heads are in the sand. We have come to crossroads in these farming systems, in this food systems perspective. We cannot afford to have our heads in the sand. It's going to catch up with us. So I really hope that all of us can understand that we need to do the right thing from a carbon farming perspective. We have the opportunity to do the right thing.
Dr. Agnes Kalibata, President of the Alliance for a Green Revolution Africa, thank you so much for your hope and fear. Liam Condon, please. What's your biggest hope and fear?
Yeah, I guess my biggest hope, if you say even by 2030, it's probably too ambitious, but I think we need to aim high. I think we need to be aiming to decarbonize the food system, as has already happened or is happening more aggressively in other industries. And that's my biggest hope, is that we can actually get there through a farmer-centric approach. And I think this is really important. Whatever we do, it's got to work for farmers. Of course, it's got to work for consumers. But first and foremost, the ones who have to do the work in the fields, on the ground, are farmers. So we got to make sure this works for them. My biggest fear is that we're moving too slowly. We don't have time. I mean, Agnes already said it. We don't have time. We got to move fast. We got to have a burning sense of urgency to push this forward, to accelerate it as much as possible. And that's where I think not everybody has realized how pressing the issue is. and that's something I still think we need to address more aggressively.
Liam Condon from Bayer, thank you so much. And Ambassador Ertharin Cousin, your biggest hope, your biggest fear?
My biggest hope is that all the things that we've talked about here today that will make carbon farming not just a possibility, but a reality for farmers, as Liam said, across the globe, in a way that incentivizes them and provides them with the financial support that is necessary for farming to be a business that they can continue to produce and perform in a manner that provides that financial incentive, but also makes that positive climate impact. Because farming is an agriculture, and the food system improvements that we've been talking about today can not only reduce the amount of impact that agriculture has on farming, but it can also positively affect the emissions by taking emissions out of the atmosphere over a longer period of time and sequestering them for a longer period of time. So solving the problem and maintaining those solutions for the entire global community, not just the agricultural community, but for all of us. My biggest fear is that this conversation that we're having is because the world is paying attention to food systems. There's conversations happening about environment and sustainability of food. I fear that we will lose the momentum. Any momentum that we gained from the highlights that COVID showed on why we need to have a food system that functions for all, that as we move forward, we will reduce that level of prioritization of carbon farming and food system support that will limit our ability to capture the full benefits of what this work could achieve.
Ertharin Cousin, visiting scholar at the Center on Food Security and Environment at Stanford University. Thank you very much or to all three of you for lending us your expertise, but also for giving us a glimpse of what you probably also private expectations are on where this is heading. Thanks so much for being with us today.